on today's show.
I think there is a danger that we run after methodology rather than going with the truths, which are timeless, and working out in our own situation, whether that be on the mission field or even, in our own churches, how do we apply those truths to these people?
Stay tuned. Hey, listeners, the Radius Missiology Conference is coming up in June. They're just as serious there about missiology as we are. You'll love it. We'll be recording live there just like last year, and we want you to be a part of it. We're giving away 5 tickets for the live event at Christ Covenant Church in Matthews, North Carolina, as well as 5 live stream passes to that conference. To enter, go to missionspodcast.com/radius22. missionspodcast.com/radius22. And to learn more about the conference, go to radiusinternational.org and let them know that we sent you. So good luck in the giveaway, and we'll see you soon. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, one of your hosts, here with your other host, Scott Dunford, pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. And I'm coming to you from ABWE. Now, for our listeners, a week or more has passed, but for us, well, just a few moments have passed since our last interview. It's sort of like stepping in and out of the wardrobe in Narnia. You realize that no time has passed at all.
It's exactly like that. Yes.
Exactly, right. I was old and I come out and I'm young again. And I'm young again as we begin this podcast. We just spoke to Michael Bandriaki from Uganda and serving here in Lancaster County about when helping helps. That was a gripping conversation and kind of in keeping with global guests and guests that are here in studio. We're also welcoming John Rollinson, who is general manager of the Banner of Truth Trust based out of the UK and who happens to be here in central Pennsylvania. John, we're glad you're here today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here.
So Scott and I don't want to speak for you, Scott, but we've both, I think it's fair to say, we've been blessed by Banner books.
Extremely, yes.
I think a lot of our listenership is going to feel that way as well. My bookshelf here, I think you'd probably see a good handful of Banner books. If you don't see that many, don't be offended that I keep all my good books at home. These are just the books that I show off at work. So all the Banner books, the rest of them are at home. A lot of the Puritan paperbacks are there. Anyway, it's really good to have you here in our office makeshift studio here today. And for those that aren't familiar with your publishing company, because that's what it is, it's a publishing ministry, tell us about the trust.
Okay, well, you need to go back a few years in history to pick up the start of the work. The work really started in embryonic form in about 1955, and it started off with a magazine. And back in that period of history, one of the gentlemen who is still on our board of trustees, Ian Murray, was in a church in Oxford. And the minister of the church in Oxford there and Ian got together and produced a magazine that was called The Banner of Truth. And when they produced the first magazine, there was no real expectation that there would be a second edition of the magazine. There was a hope, but there was no necessary expectation. But there was some funding that was given to them to produce a second edition of the magazine, and so they produced a second edition. And now that magazine is a monthly magazine. We're 60-odd years on now, and that is still being produced every month. So that really was the start of the Banner of Truth. But it was about 2 years before the publishing started, publishing of books. And the history to that was that Ian at that point had moved from Oxford and was now in London. He was an assistant to Martin Lloyd-Jones at Westminster Chapel in London. And he'd been asked to do some historical sort of church history talks in the church, which he was doing. And in the course of that, he referenced a number of authors from older times. And there was a gentleman who was present at those talks who then asked Ian, well, you mentioned this person, you've mentioned that person, you've mentioned the other person. How can I get the books that you're referring to? And Ian's response really was, well, actually, that's very difficult. They're very hard to find, and you need to go into secondhand bookshops to find them. And the gentleman was very much a businessman. In fact, there are still some technological things that are in use today that are named after him, actually, but that's a different story. And he said to him, well, we need to fix this. This is a problem. What would it take to fix it? And that really was the start of the publishing ministry of the Banner of Truth. So 1957, the Banner of Truth Trust was formed, and the first books then were being produced. It's gone on since then. So in the early days, most of what the Banner produced were reprints of older books, things that have been published from the Reformation period through to the Puritan period on into the sort of 19th century and early 20th century. And that was the core of what we were producing. So Puritans, Reformers, and the likes of, Ryle and Spurgeon in the sort of 1800s. And then as time went by, more things were introduced into the mix. So modern day authors. Ian himself started writing, and we published quite a number of Ian Murray's titles. So today, what we publish is a mixture. It's a mixture of older books and newer authors as well.
And yet, even for those newer authors, there's something unique that makes a Banner book, right? You're not necessarily going to stop at the offices here in Carlisle, nearby where we are, and pick up off the shelf, 10 Steps to a Victorious Christian Marriage or something like that, some sort of very pop kind of bubblegum title. There's something unique that makes a Banner book.
Sure, that's very true. And in a sense, what we're looking for from a modern day author is this author expressing something in a way that's going to be helpful, not just today, but in 100 years or 200 years. And that fits really with the model of publishing, because what we started off doing was republishing things that have been written, 200, 300, 400 years ago. And we believe that they were timeless truths that were being expressed. So when the Puritans are writing, they're writing things which have a timelessness to them. They're biblical, they're truths. And biblical truths don't change, do they? So when we're looking for a book today from a modern day author, it's that kind of thing we're looking for. We're looking for things that major on biblical truths. And there are times that there are perhaps current issues in the church, and people will write books that address those current issues, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But one of the difficulties can be that current issue may only be an issue for 3 months, 4 months, right, 6 months, a year. And so that book in 2 years' time is almost obsolete because it was just focused on that issue. So what we tend to look for is things that would focus on the principles and the biblical principles. So we have a couple of books, for instance, that are on the subject of justification. And in many ways, they were a response to things that were going on a few years ago in the church, and disagreements and arguments and discussions and theological differences.
Thankfully, all the arguing's over now.
Yes, that's right. So that issue has moved on. Yeah. But the books that we published are actually still very relevant because they're dealing with the biblical doctrine of justification. Yeah. And in a sense, that's what we're looking for. So a Banner book is something that we trust will have applicability outside of our own lives. And so production-wise as well, we aim to produce, particularly with our hardback books, we're looking to produce books that we think will be on people's bookshelves for a long time. Yeah. I have some books in my office back in Edinburgh. I know there's one sitting on my table at the moment that was published in 1701. And the binding's not in great shape, I have to say, but you can still read it. And I'd like to think that, the hardback books we're producing today, in 300 years' time, people will still be able to pick them up. They won't have fallen to pieces and disintegrated to nothing. They'll still be books, and people will be able to pick them up and read them and benefit from them.
Beautiful.
One term that gets used to talk about Banner of Truth and the kind of theology that Banner of Truth is putting out is called experimental religion. When I hear that term, and I'm sure many people hear it, they can imagine, maybe someone in the corner of their house just trying out creative new ways to practice their faith. That isn't what's meant by this.
Test tubes.
Right.
We're spiritually Breaking Bad here.
Yeah, I wonder if I pray standing upside down, if this will produce something better in my prayer life. That isn't what's meant by that. What is meant by this idea of experimental religion? And how does it play out in Banner's books?
Yeah, so we often refer to experimental or experiential Christianity. And I think what we're really saying is that the meaning of it is that your faith is something that you experience, and you live a life that is showing out the truths of Scripture, the truths of the gospel. It's not something that is just an academic study. It's a meaningful thing. It affects the way you live. It affects the way you think. There's a role for the work of the Spirit in the life of a Christian, or there should be a role for the work of the Spirit in the life of the Christian. And that's very much part and parcel of what we talk about when we're talking about experimental Christianity or experiential Christianity. It's what you live and experience in your life. It's not a cold, doctrinal, academic study that we're engaged in, but it's something that is a living faith. It's something that in our own lives we live out in our lives. And how does it come out in the books? Well, I think it comes out in the books in the way that the books are written. So we don't typically produce a book that is a very academic book. We're producing books that are academically sound, if you want to put it like that, but doctrinally, theologically good material, but applied. So, if somebody came to us and said, I've done a master's on some subject, would you publish it? The answer to that would be no. Go away and write a book about it. And take what you've learned in your studies and write something that will be helpful to a Christian in their Christian living and in their Christian life, will be helpful to a Christian in the life that they have to live within the church, that will be helpful to build the body of Christ in the church. And that's, I think, where it comes out. So we believe that, what we believe makes a difference to the way we live, and it should make a difference to the way we live, should make a difference to our Christian experience. So, we sit in church and we listen to a sermon. Something that is a sermon that is experiential will affect us. We shouldn't be able to leave that place without being changed, without thinking about how does this truth of Scripture affect the way I'm going to go out this week and live my life.
Right.
What I love about that is it kind of goes against the stereotype of those of us who come from a Reformed background, the frozen chosen stereotype that gets thrown around. And that dovetails to our concern on the Missions podcast, which is not just that old-time religion, but that old-time missionary spirit as well. So from what you've gleaned from this rich, historic Protestant heritage that Banner is all about advancing and making accessible, does that heritage, because it's a living tradition, is there a missionary spirit in that heritage, in your opinion? And what would be some examples of that?
Yeah, very very so, yes. I think perhaps in the late 1800s through into the 1900s, the impression that a lot of people had was, if you're a Calvinist, well, you don't believe in mission. How can you believe in mission if you're a Calvinist? But that wasn't the position in days gone by. And, if Spurgeon, for instance, we have a little booklet by Spurgeon, which is all to do with, evangelism and Calvinism. And certainly in years gone by, there were many people who would be Calvinistic, but had a tremendous missionary zeal. Even Calvin himself, go back to Calvin and look at what he was doing. He was sending missionaries all over the place. And often he was sending missionaries out, and those missionaries, when they left Geneva, they knew that there was a very high probability they were going to die. They were going into persecution. So there is a strong history of missionary activity from those who are Calvinistic. You see it in, we have a book called the St. Andrew Seven. You see it there. These were guys who were Calvinists, but these are 7 guys who went off into the mission field. Almost throughout the church history, you can see a strand of mission activity that is strongly related to what we would consider to be biblical Christianity. David Brainerd, John Payton, these sorts of folks, Robert Murray McShane, even people like that too. So there's a very strong link between our Christian heritage and a Calvinistic Christian heritage, a Reformed Christian heritage, and the whole idea of mission. And it is driven, you look at some of the things that Jonathan Edwards was involved with. Again, very mission-oriented in the way people thought. And I think that perhaps got a little lost in the early 20th century. And in a sense, some of that was linked to what happened theologically in the early days of the 20th century. Yes. So the whole downgrade controversy you see with Spurgeon, I think that contributed towards the loss of the sort of missionary zeal.
So as theological liberalism slips in, the missionary spirit slips out.
Yes, I think that's probably true to say, yes.
And that's interesting because I think so much of that compromise does happen, at least under the guise of love, concern for others, compassion, things that might be linked to missions or evangelistic outreach in some way. And yet that's not true, right? Once we lose hold of the center, well, what is it that we even have to give to the world?
That's absolutely right. What we have to give to the world is the gospel, and the gospel isn't a social program. It may lead to a social program,
right,
but it isn't a social program. And again, there are examples of that in things that we've published. There's a book that we've published on Richard Hobson. Richard Hobson was a minister in Liverpool in the same time that Ryle was there. So Ryle was Hobson's bishop. And the story of what went on in that part of Liverpool is quite remarkable. And it was an area of the city that was known to be just a terrible, terrible place. It was the place where, there was one particular street that was a street of prostitution and vice, and it was known as the Little Hell. And by the time you get to the end of Hobson's ministry there, it was said that there wasn't a house of ill repute, as they were called. There wasn't a house of ill repute left within the parish. And when you read his story, what you understand is that this man brought the gospel to this place. Now, that's not to say everybody was converted, because they weren't. But the influence of the gospel in terms of the social outworking of the influence of the gospel was remarkable. And the church, again, it was in a part of Liverpool known as Windsor, and employers avoided Windsor men. You don't employ a Windsor man because he'll be a crook. He's not going to work hard. And again, that all turned round, and you found that in the church, they did have social programs. So they had what was, I suppose, a prototype of the labor exchange. They would help people to find jobs. You couldn't get a bank account if you lived in that area. So the church helped people to save money and wisely use their finances. So there were social programs that came out, but it was led by the gospel. And when you read some of the things that he preached, it's remarkable. It's just straightforward gospel preaching. And the outworking of that was conversions. There were many conversions, the building of the church, but the sanctifying influence on the rest of society was also very significant.
I was certain when you were going to talk about Liverpool Street that it was going to be Penny Lane, but you disappointed me. I have to say, the Banner of Truth biographies, especially the missions biographies, have deeply impacted me. From probably one of the most impacting ones is the Amy Carmichael biography that you published. That is something I've read many times, but the 5 missionary biographies, and then something we've talked about on here, which was a book I hadn't seen before, but working amongst Korean Christians here in the Bay Area, the Korean Pentecost was fantastic and very helpful to understanding the work of God that was done on the Korean Peninsula. So I'm just curious, as you are working with these books all the time and interacting with this, what are some of the missionary biographies that have inspired you? And I want to add more to that too, but just go ahead. What's some of the missionary biographies that have inspired you? Okay,
well, two particular ones, which are sort of longer biographies. So things like the 5 Pioneer Missionaries that we publish are sort of short biographies, 5 biographies in one book. But there's 2 particular books.
Every missionary needs to have that on their shelf and read it to your kids. Anyway, go ahead.
5 Pioneer Missionaries, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Two particular books, and they're related to each other. And this is one of the reasons why I actually think they're a very good read together. And that is the biography of John Payton, and also the book that his wife wrote as well. And it's fascinating because you read the John Payton biography, and I think many people would accept it's one of the classic missionary biographies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He goes to this South Sea island in the Pacific. They were people who were cannibals, headhunters, and the work that he does there is remarkable. There's a lot of sadness in his life, loss of wives, children, and so on. But it's a tremendous story of missionary activity, of reliance on God, and seeing the hand of God at work in that situation. But the book by his wife is also interesting because you get a different view of it, and you get a lady's view of it. So you have the man and his view of it, and then you have the wife and her view of what was going on. And it's a fascinating read. And at times it's very sad. There are parts of that book that would move you to tears. I think particularly if you're a parent, would move you to tears. But there's also parts of the book that will have you laughing out loud. So, for instance, there's a little section in the book where she's talking about some clothing that had been sent out to them, and they had been distributing to the native folks there. But the problem was the folks didn't know what the different bits of clothing were. And so they turn up to church with various parts of clothing on the bits of the bodies that it's not really designed to be on. And it really is very funny, and she has to come out of the service herself because she can't but laugh, she has to go outside. So she's, it's great. And you just get this other perspective. Another book that we published, which I think is a very challenging book, and it's the autobiography of Faith Cook. Now, Faith Cook's parents were missionaries in China, and it's the story of her early life and what happened, and having to be evacuated out of China and so on. And it's also very challenging, I think, in the context of mission, as to how do we treat our children? So, what do you do as a missionary when you have children? Should they be with you on the mission field, or should they be somewhere else? And there's some real issues, I think, around that, things that people need to think carefully about. And I think Faith addresses that rather nicely in her book. It's a challenge, I think, to missionary thinking.
Well, there's a lot we talked about earlier. There's so much of Christian literature that just ends up at the dump eventually, right? It ends up on the ash heap of history. Doesn't stand the test of time. And obviously, Banner's trying to do something different from that. I can't help but think that there's also an analogy there for the way that we go about ministry, and so much of what we do. The fire comes, and is it going to remain or not? Is it going to be wood, hay, or stubble, or is it going to be built upon the right foundation? Right. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that so much of what's written isn't standing the test of time? Because I think that if we can get that right, not just in what we write and what we read, but also in what we do and what we do on the mission field at home and abroad.
Yeah, I think there's probably several reasons. I mean, there's certainly in the West anyway, so within sort of America, within the UK, there's certainly an issue that the latest and the greatest is the best. And so publishers have rushed to get things out. Now, I think that's perhaps changed a little bit in very recent days, but certainly over the last 20 years or so, it will be true that, a bookstore wants the new book, and they want the new book on the shelf. So when somebody comes through the door, they see the new book. But they don't want that new book on display for very long, because that person's going to come back again and they want something else new for them. Yeah. And so there's been a tendency for publishers to just publish lots and lots and lots of books. And that doesn't necessarily mean that those books are quality books, that there's, they know they're not going to last long. There was a period in time a few years ago where the shelf life, as they described it, so this is the time that in a bookstore, a book would be face out on the shelf rather than spine out on the shelf. So the shelf time of a book was down to a matter of weeks, just a couple of weeks. And so to feed that demand, you have to produce a lot. Yeah. But it's very difficult to produce large quantities that are good quality books. And so things come and disappear, and within a year they're remaindered, disappeared. So I think that there is something that publishers have to answer for to some extent in that regard, because Christian publishing became a business, and the business model demanded that. But I think as well as that, it's also true to say that an awful lot of books that have been produced probably shouldn't have been produced. They're not really literature that is going to stand the test of time. Sometimes it's a fad. that's been written about, and so it disappears. We mentioned this earlier, that what we're seeking to do at the Banner is to have things published that will stand the test of time. So we don't typically publish on the fad. We publish on the principle that might allow you to assess the fad. Right. And I think this, again, to some extent, it's a weakness in the church in general. So I feel there's far too many people in churches who are looking for the answer rather than looking to be able to answer the problem themselves, in the sense that they're spoon-fed. So rather than be taught, look, this is what the Bible teaches, now there's something new that's cropped up. Can you apply the things you know about what the Bible teaches to this new fad, whatever it might be, and then evaluate it? No, they want somebody to tell them. I can't think, so I want you to think for me and tell me. And that again spawns books. Yeah. Who's going to tell me? Well, okay, some guy somewhere is going to write a book about this, and then that's going to tell you the answer to this question. And I think that's another factor as well. That there's far too many people who don't want to do the work themselves of applying biblical truths to how they should live their Christian lives. They just want to be told. Yeah. And that's why you get the 5 steps to this, 10 methods of this, and so on. We don't want to work that out ourselves. Yeah. We just want to get told.
It's all already chewed and regurgitated and partially digested. I was hoping what you said would be relevant to not just fellow publishers, but to missionaries, and not just authors, but to practitioners in ministry. And it was. I think there's so much there, right? Because even if you're not somebody who's looking at, you're a content creator, or you're a publisher or anything like that, there's so much to be said for how much of the ministry that we do and the talks that we give and content that we're bringing in others' lives is harping on a fad, or is simply not encouraging people, discipling them to the point of understanding Scripture and applying it themselves, but giving them, here's my application, here's my take, you just take that and run with that as if it was your own.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And in a sort of, I guess in a missions context, it's the same in a sort of church planting context and so on. There is a danger that we run with what is the latest idea, rather than saying, look, the truths of Scripture are timeless. Now, the way we apply those truths, yes, there are changes in the way we have to apply those truths, because, just as if you're teaching in Sunday school to children, you don't apply the truths of the Scriptures in quite the same way to a child as you would do to somebody who's an adult.
Right.
There are differences in the way that you talk to them. And so in a mission situation, if you're going into a place where there is no Christian heritage of any description whatsoever, then you need to think carefully about how you apply the truth of Scripture to the people in that situation. But there's a danger, I think, sometimes of saying, okay, well, the latest methodology for doing that is this, so we'll do that. Well, that methodology doesn't last. That methodology is going to change in a year or in 5 years. And I think there is a danger that we run after methodology rather than going with the truths, which are timeless, and working out in our own situation, whether that be on the mission field or even, in our own churches, how do we apply those truths to these people? So, a minister who's standing to preach on a Sunday, how does he apply the truths that he is expounding to the individual that's in his congregation? And it's one of the reasons, of course, why it's so important for people to be connected to a church and to a local church, and not just be sitting there every Sunday listening to whoever the greatest name is on the internet who's preaching.
Or even reading banner books at home by yourself.
Or even reading banner books.
Absolutely,
absolutely, yes. Because, the guy on the internet who you're listening to is not your pastor. Right. He knows nothing about you. Right. But your pastor does know you. And the same is true in a mission situation. You should know, as the mission person, you should know the people that you're interacting with. And if you don't know them, how can you work with them? There's a very personal relationship, I think, that's required in those sort of situations, to take the truths that are timeless and then apply them to the people who need to hear those truths. And what a person needs to hear when they're unconverted is not the same as what they need to hear when they've been a Christian for 20 years. Right. There are things that everybody needs to hear. To hear the gospel preached, you should never tire of hearing the gospel preached. Right. But there is a difference, in a sense, for a mature Christian to somebody who's unconverted in the way that you would perhaps speak to them.
Yeah.
it's personal, but it's also helpful in reading, these saints of time past that have a high view of God and a deep relationship with God. And even, I think the Christian biographies and the biographies of Martin Lloyd-Jones and others that Banner puts out, to see, well, they have a high view of God, but their God is also my God, and yes, believers, in Uganda's on our mind this morning, in Uganda worship the same God as I worship. And Amy Carmichael's God is the same God who did those miracles and those powerful things in India, is the same God as at work at my life. And so I think there's a value, in reading these books from times past and also from parts of all over the world that connect us to, there's a personal element, but it's a personal element that is also universal and goes back in time. It goes across the world and connects us to the same awesome, great God. So I think it's important that we talk about, books and how they can be used around the world. Could you tell us a little bit about the Book Fund and the work that it does to advance gospel work overseas? And how has Banner had a global impact?
Yeah, sure. The Book Fund really came about in the early 1960s. And the sort of history to it is that one of our employees was reading about Mrs. Spurgeon, and Mrs. Spurgeon started a book fund. Mm-hmm. And her book fund was started to help pastors who perhaps couldn't afford to buy books to get books. So she raised money and she sent out books. And there were conferences that Spurgeon had, and she would help at the conferences to give away books to the ministers who came and so on. And in reading that story, one of our members of staff was very moved by it and said, well, this is such a great idea. We should do something like this. And that's really how the Book Fund started off. And the Book Fund helps all sorts of different people. And over the years, I sent books, I would imagine, over a course of about a 3-year period, there's really only a handful of countries in the world that we wouldn't send something to. So I guess over the course of, 1960 to today, so what's that, 60 years, we've probably sent books into almost every country in the world through the Book Fund work. And the impact of it, how do you measure the impact of it? I think to some extent I'd have to say we'll not know the impact of that until glory. We just won't. But having said that, we do have some stories that come up from the Book Fund and the work of the Book Fund. And they make me believe that we're only hearing the surface of those stories. But it makes me believe that the Book Fund has been greatly used and the books have been greatly used. So, I heard Conrad and Biwi just the other week was in the UK and was speaking at our ministers' conference and our youth conference there. And he was telling the young people at the conference about his experience as a young man in Zambia who was a student. And he was telling us that when he was getting money to fund him at university, and when he got his money, he would put aside from his money what he needed to pay for his board and lodging. And then the rest of the money he was using to go and buy books. And he was buying banner books, and those banner books that he was buying were being supplied into the bookstores that he was able to go to, and they were being subsidized and underwritten actually by the Book Fund. And he attributed the revival really of Christianity, but particularly Reformed Christianity within Zambia, to those books. And he was saying, I was not the only person doing this. There was a group of us who were doing this. And the books were very influential in the recovery of biblical Christianity within Zambia. And that has spread more than just Zambia. The ministry they've had has been much broader than just Zambia. We had another example of a gentleman who, on the mission field, and theologically, he would be in a very different place to where the banner is. But he'd heard that the Banner of Truth would give books away. And so he contacted us and we sent him some books. And I met him several years later. I didn't know him. We met at a conference. We were sitting around a table having lunch together, and somebody in the table, there were probably about 12 people sitting around the table. And somebody said, oh, why don't we just go around and everybody say who you are, where you're from, what are you doing, sort of thing. And we went around the table, and this gentleman said who he was, and he was at seminary at the time. And it came to myself, and I said who I was, who worked for the Banner of Truth. And I could see him almost jump on the other side of the table. And I was like, why has my name made him jump? And so afterwards I said to him, I could see there was something there. What, do you know me? I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I don't know you. So, yes, he said, you sent me books from the book fund. And he said, those books absolutely revolutionized my life and ministry. And, there are many stories like that of books that have gone into different parts of the world that God has used to really change people. And, if you go back a few years, when the Iron Curtain was still there in Europe, we had books going into, going through the Iron Curtain, going into those Eastern European countries, and people being built up in their faith, churches being changed. So, there's just a lot of stories that we tell of the effect of books on people in all different countries of the world. We've had a lot of books go into, Africa and India, on into the Far East as well. So, the book fund has been greatly used of God. And as I say, I think we probably won't know the full effect of that until we meet fellow brothers and sisters in heaven and hear about it. So,
well, I know for our listeners who may be in the U.S. or Canada or the U.K., that they can certainly purchase books from Banner of Truth. But a lot of our listeners are listening from the mission field and might be interested in sharing those resources with the people around them, with their missionary teammates. And so how can they not only get their hands on resources, but in a way that you guys are very good about getting them to people at lower minimal cost?
Sure. So they need to contact us, basically. The work of the book fund is mainly in terms of mission people, so outside of North America, is really run out of the UK. So the North American office that's just down the road from where we are today handles North American distribution, but we don't typically ship outside of the States from here. The UK office is the office that ships sort of worldwide with that. So if there are people who want to get hold of Banner Books and they can't because of where they are, they just need to get in touch, and we will attempt as best we can to help them. God has been very gracious over the years, and my predecessor, so I've been with the Banner for 23 years now. My predecessor was there for a similar length of time. And he told me when I first started, he said, I don't think we've ever had a situation where somebody asked us for help through the book fund that we had to say no because we didn't have the funds. And I would say that in my time, in the last 23 years, that's also true. We've never had that situation. God has always provided. We've been in times when perhaps the funds to do it have run low, but we've never been in a situation of somebody asking us for help through the book fund where we've had to say, I'm really sorry, but we can't do that.
Well, and shout out to your outgoing U.S. manager, Pat Daly, too. Thanks to our friend Pat, we've been able to bless for maybe the last year several of our classes of new incoming missionaries that are going out all over the world with stacks of free Banner books. In fact, we just had our International Theological Education Summit. We had probably 40 or 50 missionaries and other theological educators doing different things around the world on campuses of small Bible colleges, formal, informal seminaries, even doing online distance things, and gave them a stack as well. And so we're grateful for that. You talk about, we had a conversation many weeks back with Conley Owens about the downside of when Christian publishing becomes a business and it's completely profit driven. This is about as far away from that as possible, where it's really just, it's about the kingdom, and it's giving forward to the work of the kingdom.
Yeah, very much so. That's, in a sense, we feel that's what we're all about as an organization. In totality, that's what we're about. The book fund, obviously, very much more so. There is no commercial element to the book fund work. We're typically giving things away. Now, there's times when we do ask for contributions, and depending on where you're working in the world, that sometimes is a wise thing as well. Yeah. Because I have to say, it's sad to say that there are times that we have to try and make judgments about the requests that we get. There are parts of the world, particularly West Africa, where there is a significant black market in Christian books. And so there are times when you have to make an assessment. Is this a genuine request from somebody, or is this somebody who is trying to get something for them to sell? And we like to think we err on the side of not caution, but liberality with that, because I tend to take the view that, okay, well, if we get this wrong and the guy is just wanting to get the books to sell them, well, okay, who knows? He might read them and benefit from them.
Whether in pretense or in truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Exactly. And wherever they end up as well, then they're going to be used and beneficial. So we tend to...
I keep tracts in my wallet. I figure if anyone ever steals my wallet, the joke's on them.
Well, that's a good one, yes. So, yeah, we tend to err on the side of liberality.
And there's not a lot of money in there either.
Sure,
so, How can people find Banner of Truth if they haven't been to your website, your UK or your US website?
Well, it's banneroftruth.org. It has a geolocator on the system, so depending where you are, it will take you to the right place. If it takes you to the wrong place, which occasionally happens, then on the website itself, you've got a location thing and you can switch.
And by the time this airs, you will have just had your East Coast conference in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. So if you're one of our Central PA listeners, maybe within the ABWE family, you might have just missed that by a hair, but you're also having the West Coast Conference coming up soon, right?
We do, yeah. So we do 2 conferences a year in the States. The East Coast is always in May, towards the end of May, and the West Coast this year will be in October. So, yep, if you're interested in those conferences, they are really aimed at ministers, and we do get church elders come along as well. But the focus really is on those who are in full-time work, full-time gospel work. So missionaries, ministers are the kind of folks who are coming to those conferences.
Very good. Well, John, thank you for being here.
Yes,
and
thank you.
We're grateful for the ministry that you've been involved in as well. And we hope that you've been blessed by this episode. And if you have, please leave us a positive rating and a 5-star rating and review as well in your podcast platform of choice. That helps put this content in front of other people, and share it with a friend. We hope they're blessed by it. Maybe we can spread some of these resources worldwide as more people want to get their hands on it and see the people around them be blessed by it too. And the Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To get more information, go to missionspodcast.com. You can support us at missionspodcast.com/support. And to learn more about ABWE, you can head on over to abwe.org. Well, we'll see you next week for the Missions Podcast. Until then, thank you for listening.